New Brunswick is a quaint province on the east coast of Canada with a population of a little under 800,000 people. Like the rest of the world, New Brunswick was hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, expected to persevere and adapt to unfamiliar lifestyles. Some faced illness, isolation, economic hardship, and loss. These stressors introduced by the pandemic have the potential to negatively impact mental health. Indeed, several studies have noted worsened mental health and increased substance use associated with the pandemic, although few studies have focused on New Brunswick in particular. To better understand the toll of the pandemic, researchers at the New Brunswick Institute for Research, Data and Training used Statistics Canada survey data to examine how the mental health and substance use behaviors of New Brunswick residents may have changed during the pandemic. Survey responses from before and during the COVID-19 pandemic were compared to examine changes in depression, anxiety, self-rated mental health, alcohol consumption, and cannabis use. To gain insight into who was most significantly impacted, multivariate regression models were used to identify demographic, socioeconomic, behavioral, and pandemic-related factors associated with worsened mental health and increased substance use during the pandemic. So let's look at these results. In 2019, before the pandemic began, 9.7% of New Brunswick residents rated their mental health as fair or poor. That number reached 19% by 2021, and 35% of New Brunswick residents reported that their mental health had worsened during the pandemic. We observed an increase in the prevalence of depression in New Brunswick from 6% before the pandemic to 21% during the pandemic. The likelihood of depression increased more sharply among those aged 65 and older compared to younger people, and among those who live alone compared to those who live with others. Depression during the pandemic was more likely among people who reported certain pandemic-related experiences, including difficulty meeting financial obligations or essential needs due to the pandemic, experiencing feelings of loneliness or isolation, emotional distress, or physical health problems due to the pandemic, and increase in personal consumption of alcohol during the pandemic due to stress or loneliness. These same experiences, along with the loss of job or income due to the pandemic, were also associated with an increased likelihood of anxiety during the pandemic. In contrast to depression, the overall prevalence of anxiety increased only modestly, from 14% before the pandemic to 17% during the pandemic, and our adjusted models showed no statistically significant increase in the likelihood of anxiety during the pandemic. Substance use behaviors in New Brunswick also changed during the pandemic. 14% of New Brunswick residents reported an increase in their alcohol consumption during the pandemic. Compared to before the pandemic, the likelihood of drinking any amount at least once a week increased by 30%, and the likelihood of binge drinking at least once a week doubled during the pandemic. Increased alcohol consumption during the pandemic was more likely among those who experienced emotional distress or relationship problems due to the pandemic. 6% of New Brunswick residents reported increased cannabis use during the pandemic, and compared to before the pandemic, the likelihood of using cannabis at least once a week increased by more than 70%. Increased cannabis use during the pandemic was more likely among younger people, aged 19 to 39, and among those who experienced emotional distress or relationship problems due to the pandemic. Taken together, our results suggest that some New Brunswick residents experienced worsened mental health and increased substance use during the pandemic. Our findings provide insight into some of the potential risk factors associated with these changes and illustrate how the negative consequences of the pandemic may differ between individuals. As we recover from the pandemic and prepare to face future challenges in New Brunswick, these findings may help us begin to understand how to leverage our resources to help those who need it most. We've only briefly summarized our results here. Please visit UNB MBIRDT research publications for a detailed report or contact MBIRDT at umb.ca for more information.